want you to check your emotional pulse when I put these words on the screen. Personal rights, power and privilege, justice. Personal rights, power, privilege, justice. What's your emotional reaction to that? These words have become emotionally charged in our society. They have been unbelievably politicized. And they have created a level of political partisanship that has been so unbelievably toxic. Can I be honest with you? Here's my honest take on this. These words should be emotionally charged, but they should not be divisive for Christians. They should be emotionally charged, meaning there should be a passion. We're going to see that here in just a couple minutes. There should be a passion in response to this, but they should not be a divisive issue. Because at the end of the day, as we say it all the time, these aren't first and foremost political issues. Things get thrown into the political landscape. But for Christians, there should be unity around these words. There should be a recognition that the surrendering of personal rights in given situations amplifies the gospel, showcases the gospel of Jesus Christ, because we serve one who laid down his rights for us. The idea of having power and having a stewardship of that power is something that we all should understand based on what Jesus taught in Matthew 20 about how it is that his disciples were supposed to leverage the power that they had. The idea of privilege should not be a guilt-inducing thing, and it should not be an accusatorial thing. It should be a recognition that if I have it, I have to figure out why and what I need to do with it. When it comes to justice, we serve a God whose heart breaks over justice to the extent that he's chosen to make every means possible available through the work of Jesus to accomplish justice in this world and to bring shalom into every part of this world. These are emotionally charged words, but they should not be politicized or divisive words for Christians. Unfortunately, they are. We're in this series that we've called Rebuild, and first and foremost, we're looking at God's fulfilling of his covenant of providing the means by which the wall of Jerusalem was built up once again after many years in exile. And ultimately that this, because of God's providential hand in this, that this wall is rebuilt in just 52 days after approximately 100 years it had been tried and it was failed over and over again. Nehemiah led that charge. And what we read in Nehemiah is essentially the last recorded events chronologically of what we see of the Jews before we get to the Gospels. Because right after all of this concludes, the silent years begin. And there's more than 400 years of silence where God doesn't seemingly speak or reveal something until we get to Jesus. So first and foremost, it's about God fulfilling his covenant. Now, secondarily, what we're also doing is asking the question, what are some of the principles, what are some of the things that we can glean from this incredibly significant letter to talk about the rebuilding of our lives when things have gotten messed up? Or just building in the first place, that we're trying to build in a direction. And what we've watched is through this whole story, through this narrative, we've seen Nehemiah grieve deeply over the plight of his people. We've seen him have a holy discontentment, wanting it to change and wanting to do something about it, but not being sure what to do. We've seen him declare his desperate dependence, and where that grief and that prayer time was focused and intense for about 3 to 4 months. We've seen him possess an unwavering confidence in having God's favor on him as he begins to do the work. We've seen him take some strategic risks already to get this work accomplished. We've seen him trust that God's presence is there in the midst of it while the enemies begin to accuse and attack. we've seen this idea that we need to expect opposition, because if we're building in the direction that God has called us, if we're trying to rebuild something that God is in the midst of, that the enemy doesn't want to see that happen. And there needs to be a recognition and expectation of opposition. And so often we're surprised by opposition, which is what discourages us rather than encourages us, because it tells us that maybe God is actually doing something and we're a part of it. And then we said last week that we need to maintain situational awareness, because if the enemy is in opposition to it, that there's going to be ways in which he attacks that are going to be surprising to us. And there's times where there's temptation, there's times where there's distractions, there's a variety of things that come at us that we don't stop to recognize is actually the work of the evil one. And so we need to have a situational awareness when it comes to recognizing what's around us in this spiritual warfare reality that we are in. So we're going to pick up the conversation in chapter 5. And at about this time, the wall is almost complete. It's not quite. We'll see that in a minute. But it's almost completed. But there's something really, really going wrong in this space. And you heard it as it was being read just a few moments ago. But there's some significant unrest because there's some major financial problems. And those major financial problems are now contributing to significant injustice and specifically exploitation. There's a famine in the land which has limited the financial prosperity of many that are there in Jerusalem. There's also ongoing taxes that are being levied against the people. You've got many people who have given up their work so that they can help build the wall. And so you have these situations where you've got people that are just not able to make the living on a daily basis that they were because they're involved in building the wall. You've got loans that have been taken out that are now being defaulted on, and because those loans are being defaulted on, they're selling their children into slavery. The problem is they're doing it to wealthy landowners of the Jews. And then, as completely against all of the customs and the laws of the day within Israel, the Jews were not allowed to charge interest in this way, and there is this. It's 1% is what it says, but it's actually 1% per month, which we can all understand is 12% interest is being charged on these loans, which is one of the major reasons why there's default. And so in the midst of that, we see this in verse 1 of chapter 5. We read this: "Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, 'We are sons, and our daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain. We must have the means to do that.' Others were saying, we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine. So others were saying, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, we have yet to subject our sons and daughters. We have had to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. The rich were exploiting the poor. The privilege of some were leveraging their power against the weak, and they were taking advantage of this moment. So while God is showcasing his providential care and fulfilling his covenant to Israel, those same people are exploiting the weaker among them. While God is showing up in significant ways, some of the people are saying, sweet, let's take advantage of this opportunity. Never miss a great crisis. Let's see what we can do out of this. And rather than moving in the direction of figuring out how do I leverage my resources to help accomplish the work that God's clearly involved with, they're trying to figure out how do we exploit this for future gain long term. Boy, I'm glad that doesn't happen in our society anywhere. It's a gut-wrenching thing, especially when you recognize as readers the way that God showed up in the midst of this. And there's all of this crazy stuff going on. And so I would suggest this. Injustice is the inevitable and correctable reality whenever progress is being realized. Whenever there's a correction being made, whenever there's something that happens and people step in to try to rebuild something or correct something, you ever notice that we tend to throw the pendulum to the other direction? Where all of a sudden now others are being mistreated, or maybe there's injustice to another group because we've gone too far the other direction. We've seen that in our society, right? We recognize that. And so there's whenever progress is being made, whenever there's an attempt to move things forward, injustice is inevitable because we're flawed people. So our solutions are rarely perfect. And while we are passionate and want to step in and do something, oftentimes we will either overcorrect or will bring about unintended consequences. And here's the point. We've got to be in tune with that, and we've got to be willing to correct those things when they happen, so that other groups are not unnecessarily marginalized or mistreated in the process. But I love seeing Nehemiah's response to this. So take a look at verse 6. Nehemiah's response: when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you are charging your people interest? This is completely unacceptable. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. They have leveraged some of the money that they were given by King Artaxerxes, who has provided the means to rebuild this wall. They've leveraged some of that money to try to buy people back, and still in the midst of that, there's exploitation going. Now you are selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us. They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. We will give it back, they said, and you will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and the officials take an oath to do what they had promised. Nehemiah's response is anger. It's a righteous indignation because of the grievous nature of what was going on. And I just want to kind of summarize it this way. When we understand God's heart for justice, our right response when presented with injustice is curiosity. Not defensiveness, not politicization, not somehow, how dare you suggest that? When we're presented with the possibility of injustice, our response has to be first and foremost curiosity. Then, I would say a deep concern. And then, to whatever degree we're able to, correction. The Christian's response, when understanding the heart of God for justice and what he wants to see accomplished, because part of shalom, of peace being realized in this world, is where righteousness and justice come together. The Psalms say it's where they kiss. Which means our response, we are so steeped in this politicized conversation so often that our response when we start to hear about potential injustice is defensiveness. It's to be offended that it would even come up in this way, rather than a genuine curiosity about somebody else's lived experience. Rather than a deep concern for how that person may have been mistreated or experienced life differently, and then a desire to correct it in whatever way we are able, recognizing that there are certain limitations with that. I've talked about this before, but I've also used this phraseology. Our response to injustice should be to listen, to learn, to lament, and then to lean in to do what we can. To listen, to learn, to lament. What should our response be when people feel mistreated, when they feel like they've been violated? It should not be defensiveness. It should be grief. It should be a genuine lament. Whatever role I may have played in it, it should be genuine lament. And then to lean in and do whatever it is that I am capable of doing. Nehemiah's response of anger was right. But Nehemiah doesn't stop there. He goes on, and I so appreciate what he says here. He says, moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. There's a special allotment of food provided. He's like, no, we're not taking that. Sound familiar? Daniel? But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver for them in addition to food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people, but out of reverence for God, Not because I even felt like it was the right thing to do or I even knew exactly what the right thing to do was, but out of reverence for God and his heart for these things, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. Again, what's not said there is even though we had the right to. What does Nehemiah say? I've modeled something better for you. What are you doing? Even though I had the right, even though I was entitled to something better, I've chosen not to take it because the work that God wanted to accomplish, because his call on our lives, because him fulfilling his covenant and using us to do it was more important than that. Can I suggest this? One of the greatest expressions of the gospel is when we willingly set aside rights in pursuit of God's call in our lives. This is anti-American, I get it. This is anti-American. This is not how the American dream works. These are my rights. I need to protect my rights at all costs. You don't have the right to. And listen to me very carefully. I 100% agree that there are times where protection of personal rights needs to be honored and fought for. I am not arguing against that. Do not turn this into an all or nothing conversation. But I would also suggest this: we're overly sensitive. We're overly sensitive. We perceive a violation of rights where it's not. We're scared of losing rights when the reality is it just makes us uncomfortable. And while there is a brokenness and a corruption within our own society where we see some of this happening and we need to be responsive to that, this individual response to this catastrophization about losing individual rights, the reality is one of the greatest things that I can do in my marriage, with my kids, with my relationships, in any context I find myself, in any system that I find myself, is when I decide for a very specific purpose to surrender my personal rights so I can glorify God and I can showcase Jesus. And trust that God will protect me in the midst of it. Because I promise you this, when you are so focused on protecting your personal rights, you can't keep your eyes on Jesus. You can't do the same thing, both at the same time. You can try to focus on your personal rights, but if you're showcasing your incredible defense of that, you are incapable of asking the simple question, Jesus, how do I show your love and your grace and your patience and your generosity in this situation? One of the greatest expressions of the gospel is when we, for specific purposes, choose to just let ourselves be offended. When we allow ourselves to be the one who takes the hit. When we don't look to take our power back. When we don't look to reciprocate. When we look to simply acknowledge that on this one I'm going to take the hit. Because God's name, the glory of Jesus, and the showcasing of that to this individual or this situation or within this system is more important. Wish I could go further. I won't for sake of time. Let's move us along. There's this incredible moment in chapter 6 that I want to call our attention to. Here's the reality. We all deal with distractions. And in chapter 6, we have a major distraction on the table. And here's what happens with distractions. We're often distracted to pursue what is immediate over what is most important, to pursue what we want right now over what we want most. In fact, that's kind of what addictions are, by the way. What I want right now becomes more valuable than what I actually want ultimately. What is optional over what is essential. What I can rationalize over what is redemptive. And there's this powerful moment, the first part of chapter 6, and we've talked about the enemy forces, and we've talked about some of the things that are going on. And so we read this in the first 3 verses. When word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of our enemies, that I had rebuilt the wall and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors in the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message: come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. But they were scheming to harm me. So he gets this message: come meet with us. We want to talk to you. They've been throwing out disparaging comments. They've been making threats. The people have been scared. Now they're coming directly to Nehemiah and they're saying, we want to have a meeting with you. But Nehemiah is able to discern they're scheming to harm him. So he sent messengers back to them with this reply. Look at what he says. He says, I'm carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? I'm carrying on a great work. I can't get off this wall and go down and meet with you. I've got something more important at stake. And then it says 4 times, repeatedly, they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. I can't come down because I'm carrying on a great work. And then if you look at the next couple of verses, they actually then threaten him to say, we're going to say that basically you're trying to become the king in this region, which is going to make its way up to Artaxerxes, and then you're going to be in big trouble. And Nehemiah still holds his ground. Why? Because he's carrying on a great work. And he simply cannot calm down. He's unwavering in the face of significant distractions and threats. The enemy is regularly seeking to distract us through fear, misguided advice, and sometimes our own selfish ambitions. But it's been said well that the things that we are distracted by are never as important as the things that we get distracted from. The things that we're prioritizing and needing to do, when we get distracted, those things are never as valuable, they're never as important as the things that we are getting distracted from. And then we see this summary in verse 15 and 16. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. When our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. They recognized that there was something divine in play and that the God of Judah, while they have been making accusations and disparaging comments and they've been making threats, they stop and have to recognize God has shown up and their God is formidable. So in that rebuilding conversation, I won't rehash all of them, I'll simply add one to it. In the midst of rebuilding something, we need to establish a why that is big enough to fuel us. Through the discouragements, through the disappointments, through the frustrations, through the loss of momentum, through those moments where we're like, God, where are you? What are you doing? Why are you not showing up? We have to establish a why. What is Nehemiah's why? I am carrying on a great work. I cannot come down. This is his why. There are so many times in life that we don't make the change that we need to make because our why isn't big enough. We've been repeating the same dysfunctional cycle in our marriage, maybe going back to the same garbage over and over again that we know is destroying us, and yet our why is not big enough. Well, let me suggest this. How do you get a why that's big enough to fuel you to make the changes and to sustain the changes that God is calling us to? We recognize what Jesus' why was. And Jesus' why is found in Hebrews 12. Here's what it says. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. The gospel of Jesus Christ resets all of our whys, because we're Jesus' why. We are Jesus' why. Why was he willing to deal with the shame? Why was he willing to go to the cross? Why was he willing to separate himself from the Father? Why was he willing to go through all of it? Because we were his inheritance. Because we are Jesus' why. And when we understand that we're Jesus' why, it changes everything. Because now all of a sudden, all of the other whys, yeah, but what about this? And I want to protect this. I want to make sure that I get this opportunity. And I want to make sure that I have this. All of that stuff takes a backseat to everybody else having the same opportunity to understand that they're Jesus' wise too. And that resets the primary motivations of our heart. To maybe for the first time go have a conversation with my spouse that I've needed to have. To maybe for the first time get into rehab and actually stay it out this time. Maybe for the first time admit that I have a problem to somebody that's been telling me that for a long time. Maybe to forgive somebody. Maybe to finally just take a first step towards healing. But the question is, do we have a big enough why? And I would suggest this. Not if you don't understand that you're Jesus' why. May we understand the significance of what it means to be Jesus' why and how that reorients us completely. Because the gospel really does change everything. Would you stand together, please?